Welcome to today's show, where we're talking about conflict. How can we use conflict to enable better communication and better collaboration? I'm Matthew Laskay, and today I'm joined by a special guest, Harvey Leach, who's got a lot of experience over the last 25 years in the production lifecycle environment, particularly with Mini and Rover and the automotive industry. So we're going to be talking about how we can use that conflict to enable better collaboration, some of the tips and advice that he can bring through topics like car crash tests, product design, and design teams. So first off, I'd like to welcome Harvey. Thanks very much for joining me.
Welcome, Matthew. Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, no problem. It's good to have a slightly different side of it, where we're trying to use something that people might perceive as a negative part of business, the conflict, and how we can actually drive that to make it into a positive and increasing collaboration. So I guess before we get started, what's your sort of experience in these sorts of industries and with these type of people?
Well, I think something I've noticed throughout my career, Matt, is that a lot of the time we shy away from conflict in a way that means we end up with solutions that are the worst of compromise. So people settle almost for the lowest common denominator, which means we either compromise the product or we compromise, say, the manufacturing process. So that means we end up with poor quality or we end up with excessive costs. Whereas if we actually could engage with the source of the conflict, if you like, the source of that tension, and work with it, we can end up with a better solution.
And I guess when we're talking about conflict here, we're not talking about arguments and people refusing to talk to each other. It's almost more of a difference in opinion or a challenging kind of environment, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But to me, it's about how people handle that conflict, because you're right. It's about how can we get away from something that becomes an argument about who's going to get their way, whose preferred route forward is going to dominate over the other. So somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose, which is the mindset that a lot of people seem to have, rather than saying, well, how can we get to a point where perhaps we understand each other's position better and we work towards a solution that actually does the best job of taking into account everybody's perspectives, everybody's requirements, and end up with that better solution.
Okay, great. So maybe if we go back a step then, as I mentioned at the start, you've worked in a lot of production type of environments and high pressure environments, like I mentioned, Mini was one of them. How did you find those sorts of, I suppose, collaborations grew or didn't grow in those kind of ways?
Okay, well, I mean, let me go back to kind of when this first became really noticeable to me and significant to me and kind of led to my subsequent career direction, if you like. So if I go back to the late 80s, before I was working with Mini, but still within Rover Group, at what is now the Mini factory, and I was still in product development in those days, and my role was trying to improve the crash performance of cars. And a lot of the time we were seen as a bit of a nuisance by the product development teams, because we were trying to impose, or as they saw it, impose some really challenging requirements on the design for something that most people hoped wouldn't happen, and therefore they saw that as extra work. It wasn't that important, because this is back in the days when before car safety was a big thing. And it was like, it always felt like we were trying to win a battle rather than trying to help produce a better car. And so that got me interested in, how do we have better conversations between teams of people that have different requirements? So we embarked on a little bit of a job of education. We thought about, how can we get the design teams to engage with the requirements to make a car safer much earlier in the process. So, because historically what had happened is cars got designed, prototypes got built, The prototype got crash tested, usually pretty much at the end of its testing cycle, because obviously a car crash tends to make a bit of a mess of a very expensive prototype. And therefore we came at the end of the testing cycle when almost everything else was done and dusted. So the design was frozen and everything else. And then we do the crash test and the car fails, doesn't perform as well as it's needed. And then we're the bad boys going, now you've got to change the design. You've got to change the design.
Do you think a lot
And
of that's down
actually,
to the initial scope definition, though, of
well,
people's expectations?
exactly that, Matt, is that really the design teams didn't understand well enough. And I think that was partly us as well. As I say, it was about sort of education of what are good and bad design features. And therefore, rather than what was happening historically was that the crash guys would look at the design once it was finished and go, oh, we don't like that, we don't like that, we don't like that, that could be a problem. You know, we got much better at engaging earlier in the program and highlighting, you know, what are the things that make it work better. So therefore the engineers doing the design work could then think about that as they were playing around with concepts and thinking about packaging, and therefore it was much easier to take those requirements into account without the amount of extra work, redesign and so on that we might have had historically.
Yeah, so there's lots of areas, I guess, where we can get this conflict or difference of opinion, isn't there? There's within a project team, like you're talking about, where some people have different expectations of what you're going to get out of the end result, and they're not happy with the end result. And that, I suppose, will challenge people. But we've also got conflict within different departments, haven't we? So I work a lot with engineering and maintenance and operations groups, and you've got the three sort of departments trying to balance each other. And engineering's trying to do things by the book and have all the estimates planned out for the whole year, and that maintenance are just trying to get things fixed as fast as possible, and production just want things up and running. So you've got all of these three balances which seem to always bash into each other, and they don't really collaborate that well because they've got different agendas almost, or different definitions of what their scope is. And it sounds like a little bit the same sort of thing there, where that conflict then is sort of going against the productivity, isn't it?
Yeah, well, absolutely, because on the surface, at least in the immediate, it does look as like people have got different agendas, and it's often seen like, oh well, they don't care about all these other things I need to worry about. Yeah. They're only interested in ... So back in my world, say when I got a little bit more involved with the production side as my career developed, we'd got the designers and the stylists saying, well, we want bits of the car to look like this, look like that. And my colleagues who had to design the tooling to make the pressed metal parts were going, well, that shape is really difficult to press. Now, they might say to me, really difficult. How that translated was that, you ended up with this head-to-head between the tooling guys and the engineering or the styling guys going, oh, you can't make it like that. Yeah. They took it this way. You can't do that. And the answer was not really, you can't do that. It was, it's going to be a lot more difficult if we do that.
So what sort of comes first then in the car world is, obviously someone comes up with a concept of what the car's going to look like, and then you've got all the chassis and the suspension and all these other departments. How do you make sure that you get the right communication and collaboration with each part? Because I can go off and design an engine, but that doesn't fit with your air conditioning ducting, for instance.
Yeah, and that's where the whole collaboration thing comes in, you see, because as I say, historically everything was done in a sort of linear fashion. So you'd start with a marketing requirement. The guys would say, well, we want the car to look like this, we want the package to look like this. And then the engineers would say, well, how do we fit all the parts in? And they'd find they couldn't fit everything in and leave the gaps. And so they'd go back and the styling would have to change. And then they'd pass it over to the tooling guys and they'd say, oh, we can't make this, we can't make that. And there's more design change. And so it would go on all the way into production. And what made the big difference for me, as we got more mature as an organization, was making sure that all those different departments' requirements were better understood right at the front. The same way I talked about the crash thing was bringing the manufacturing engineering guys, the tooling guys, the assembly guys into the party much earlier, you know, and therefore all those conversations happened when there was less at stake, if you like. You know, when the design is much more a blank sheet of paper, you've got much more opportunity to make adjustments. You know, I don't think that just applies to the car world. I think that's a pretty universal principle in terms of mechanical engineering design or electronics design or whatever. You know, that, you know, when there is less at stake, the conversations become easier. Yeah.
Yeah,
People
and
don't
I guess
feel like they have to defend their hill because they're going to miss their timing, they're going to miss their cost targets or whatever. It's a lot more open, and it's time consuming, don't get me wrong.
yeah.
But I think experience says is that time generates the payoff further down the road.
So they're less defensive and blocked into having suggestions, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
So was that you're talking about how that mindset sort of changed over the time? Was that a conscious decision by the leaders and the managers group to say, right, we're going to have to redefine how we work because it's not working well? Or was it a natural evolution of how the workers actually changed the way they worked?
I think it was kind of more the former, but it was done at a whole organizational level. So there was a bit of bottom up as well as top down.
Right.
But a lot in the car industry for sure. What generated that was, going back to the 1970s and 80s, was the competition from overseas manufacturers, particularly from Japan, who got this reputation for getting cars into the marketplace that were better quality, were better value for money, more reliable. And, you know, as we started to explore the engineering of that, you then go, oh, and by the way, they get them from initial idea into the marketplace in about half the time. You know, so what is that? What is it they're doing that makes that happen? Because we knew, you know, at an organizational level, the organization knew that unless we could respond to that, we were going to go out of business. You know, we were going out, you know, what was then called the British Leyland Motor Corporation was going out of business in the 70s.
Right.
And it was this sort of market driven need, if you like, to respond to that and understand what it was that the Japanese were doing. That drove this change in working culture and working practice, if you like.
And it's happened a lot in different types of industries, what you're mentioning there with the push from somewhere else. So, you know, in the early 1900s, maintenance, you know, was all reactive, wasn't it? And when the First World War came along, the pressures changed, the demands on production changed. So they had to rethink their maintenance strategies so that it was more preventive rather than reactive. And as you mentioned there, when the car manufacturing industry got driven by the Japanese influence because they were so efficient with some of their new thinkings of total quality management and lean and those areas, that it forces us to then rethink what we're doing. So did you see a huge change in competition? I guess the way people saw that as competition, saying we need to do better.
I think people responded in very different ways, Matt. I mean, I think the people who were more progressive and the people who ended up in leadership positions within the organization definitely responded to it that way.
Okay.
You know, and I think that was, yeah, that was probably one of the reasons, I think, because there was generally a very positive response in the car industry in the UK, was one of the reasons why, say, Japanese manufacturers like Honda and Toyota and Nissan decided to base their manufacturing operations in the UK, because they saw that willingness to respond.
Okay.
You know, and we didn't go for the defensive strategy, if you like. You know, going back to the whole idea of conflict, one of the ways we could have done that was basically build a great big wall around the UK and tell the Japanese they weren't coming in. And we could have carried on producing substandard cars for the next however long. But as an industry, we chose, and as a country, we chose not to do that, and learn and grow and develop. And that took us down this whole collaborative arena. I mean, we didn't see it as collaboration initially, but that's what it became, I think, over the years.
So you're talking about internally or externally in that case?
I think it becomes both. I think initially internally, because that some of the development programs we did in terms of leadership management development definitely encouraged collaboration. We did training courses where they deliberately mixed people from different functions.
All right.
We got to understand what the different perspectives of those different functions were, which meant we stopped seeing them as the enemy. How many organizations do you find where it looks like, as you said, in an extreme example, the sales guys and the production guys feel like they're on opposite sides of a battle?
Yeah.
Rather than everybody saying, well, we're all contributing to the company's success. So certainly internally was where it started. But I think it wasn't too long before companies realized that needs to extend to the relationships with suppliers as well. Yeah. So, one of the other things we learned from the Japanese is that they had the car manufacturers, for example, had really close working relationships with all their suppliers, and therefore they were working together. Because again, the customer supplier relationship in the UK, even now, 30, 40 years on, can sometimes seem very confrontational.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And yet, if we look at the best relationships, they are very much more collaborative, because it's about recognizing common interest and then working to make sure that everybody gets something out of it, because there's only so long you can beat your supplier up before they either stop working with you or they go out of business.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at the market here, so I'm in Aberdeen, and a year ago when COVID came along, the directive from all of the big companies was you must cut your costs 30%. And that got pushed down to all of the suppliers for any services, and then that got pushed down to their suppliers. And how do you just go to somebody, you're going to cut everything by 30%, because the overheads and margins, they just don't allow 30% in most industries. So then you're getting even more of this conflict where, well, they're expecting us to cut 30% of cost. Well, how do we cut that? And then you push back to them, and then eventually just go to somebody else who's cheaper. So like you said, you've got this the suppliers and the customers aren't working together to achieve a goal. They're me and you.
Exactly that. Yeah. And in the end, out of that sort of situation, it's long term, nobody wins, really. Yep. Because either the main manufacturer or customer ends up dealing with substandard suppliers and gets cheap product for sure.
Exactly.
Doesn't last long. And by the time they realize that, the supplier they really want to use has gone out of business, so they can't go backwards.
Yeah, so where are you going to cut your costs? It's going to be on your inspections, it's going to be on your paperwork, it's going to be on your things that aren't actually directly adding that value for the end product. They may have to go out to cheaper suppliers of their steel or something else, and you're starting to lose all that control. So then you get that conflict there.
Yeah, and yet, if we look at some of the examples of the best, you'll go, let's get together. We know we've got a problem. We know we've got to get costs down. So let's work together to say, how can we, by working smarter together, by looking at where are the things we're doing that are causing unnecessary cost that's not adding value, and how can we both contribute to then bringing the cost down in a way that protects the long-term interests of everybody. Some people say it sounds idealistic, but actually where I see that done at its best, both organizations then end up thriving for the longer term.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example then. How do you think this would go in the industries you've worked in? About 5 years ago, when the oil price crashed, and they did an investigation and reports onto how we can extend the life of the industry and make sure people's skills and jobs are retained. So one of the biggest things out of the report came in that the industry needs to collaborate better together. So the initial enthusiasm and push was a whole bunch of different companies would meet together and try to share best practices and ideas and things to go together, on the hope that, you know, we could streamline the process so that we're borrowing ideas off each other and growing. But then there's this part of, well, you've got 2 or 3 companies who are doing the same thing. How likely are they actually to share their ideas and collaborate versus have this standoff and conflict between, well, I'll give you a bit, but I want more from you first, and we'll pretend we're collaborating. How do you think that would work?
I think that says a lot, doesn't it, about what are some of the foundations you need to lay for effective collaboration to happen. Because in that situation, you know, everybody's coming in with a mindset that is almost, what can I get out of it without giving too much away?
Right.
And you can understand that in a way, because it's not a way of working that European American culture is used to. It's not familiar with it. It's not been the way we've learned, you know. So we have this sort of slightly protectionist view, and therefore if people say, well, we're going to collaborate, but we're still got our mindset of protectionism, then, you know, our mindset is more of, what have we got to lose?
Yeah.
How can we avoid losing too much, rather than what is it we're looking to gain from this collaboration? You know, so I think the fundamental piece is going in with this mindset of, what can I give and what can I gain? And, you know, people could accuse me of being idealistic about this sometimes, and I guess at one extreme I probably am, but equally I think if you get the right people in the room with the right mindset, and they say, what is the common goal we're all working towards? So there definitely is stuff where you go, no, that's our competitive advantage. But I think if you stop and think about that, there's a lot less than you would imagine. And you've got a lot more to gain by pooling knowledge, pushing the boundaries. Because if you do that, from my point of view, the whole marketplace gains. Yeah. And therefore there should be a win for everybody. I mean, let me give you an example, because one of the things is the sort of benchmark company in the car industry, if not a lot of manufacturing, is Toyota. One of the interesting things about Toyota was that they've never ever attempted to hide how they do stuff. You know, they've always been very open. They've hosted people on visits. They've let researchers come and spend time and everything else. Because they've reached a position where they said, we don't feel threatened by people coming and looking at and attempting to learn from us. And that feels very counterintuitive, doesn't it, a lot of the time? But when pushed about it, Toyota's answer was really interesting, I think. And they said, well, look, if you're learning from our best practice, the best that'll ever happen is you'll get as good as we are today. Yeah. By which time we'll have moved on. So there's a bit about, you know, if we understand what it is that makes us unique as a company, what's our USP, what's the thing we can be better at than anybody else, then that's your contribution to the thing. And nobody else is going to be better at that than you are, because that's in your organization's DNA. And therefore, you're always going to maintain that edge. And if you focus on that and understand that, then that means you're not threatened by what the others will do, because that's something that is unique to your organization. It's not something anybody else can easily replicate.
I guess that's like the restaurants over the last few months have started releasing what their recipes are for their, you know, their meals. You know, some of like Wagamama and things of like, or fish and chip shops around the corner from us have gone, oh, here's the recipe on how we actually make our batter that you all love. Go and make it yourself until you can come back. So it's like you said, if you're comfortable in what you've got and you still know that that's your USP, that's only going to help you.
Yeah, exactly. You're not throwing, because they don't, and people will try making it at home, won't they? They'll try
Yeah.
making, and they're going, God, this is such a pain. And we don't
And it's not
quite
as
get
good.
as good as the chip shop or Wagamama's. So it's almost like, yeah, can't wait for restrictions to ease so we can go out and buy it from the shop so we don't
Yeah.
have to do all this stuff. And at one level, it raises the appreciation for the ability of the supplier, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And there's a good example you're talking there about that some of the Japanese companies were sharing, the Toyota production system, and that everyone's quite familiar with these days. There's a really good book called Black Box Thinking, and it's by an author named Matthew Syed. And
Yeah.
he talks about the difference between the airline industry and the health system. So if you look at how the airline industry works, they've got the black box that records absolutely everything that happens in an aeroplane. And every time there's a failure or an incident, they make an effort to go and get it, collect all the information, but then they share all of their findings with the rest of the aviation industry so everyone else can learn from that problem. If you look at the other side of it, what he talks about is the medical industry. And when there's something that happens, it's more about, it's just one of those things where these things happen, we did our best and we'll move on and try to do something else better. And they hide it a bit more because they don't want it to be public. Maybe they're worried about liability and things like that more. So the learnings from potentially whatever went wrong or what happened doesn't get shared versus some other industry. Look at how many failures we have in the airline industry now compared to 40 years ago. It's a massive difference because of that collaboration.
No, absolutely. And that touches on another really important thing, doesn't it? Is about how willing are we to be open, to be vulnerable, to be prepared to admit to the areas where we know we're not as good.
Yes.
Yeah. And couple that with a willingness to learn. Because in the end, collaboration works best when everybody learns from everybody else. Because I'll bet by converse, in the right culture, there'd be a lot the airline industry could learn from the healthcare system, because there's lots of good things, and often we think, because one bit's bad, the whole thing's bad.
Yes. So you've got two sort of things that are blocking collaboration then, aren't you? You've got the conflicts and the defensive thing about trying to protect your own.
Yeah.
And then you've also got the thing about trying to achieve a goal which is maybe not defined or not even.
Yeah. And I think the goal thing's really important because, what really drives good collaboration is recognizing the goal that all the parties share. And that goal actually almost overriding, or at least being given greater prominence than the individual goals of each of the players, where those might be in tension, because the overarching goal becomes the thing that unites everybody and says, if we can achieve that goal, that's where everybody wins. Yeah. Example we've used before is like the peace process in Northern Ireland. There was no way the Protestant side and the IRA side were ever going to agree about their individual objectives, because one, at its simplest, one was, we want to remain part of the United Kingdom. We want to, we want a united Ireland. But the thing they both wanted was an end to the violence, because they recognized how damaging that was to both communities. And therefore, the peace process was kind of contingent on them saying, well, achieving that goal actually requires us to make our individual goals that are in conflict less important than the big goal. And I think I've oversimplified it hugely, I know, just to make the point, but it's, I think it's a useful illustration nonetheless.
Yeah. So based on your experiences then and all of those different areas we've talked about, we've covered quite a few different industries and areas there. And we know that conflict is thought of as a bad thing in general, but we can use that conflict to actually be more proactive and productive by collaboration.
Yeah.
So if you were sort of to give advices to teams out there who are maybe in that area of, at the moment, you know, maybe it's engineering and maintenance operations, maybe it's different parts of an assembly process, maybe it's different regions of a country, if you want to go out that wide.
Yeah.
How can we focus our energy from being in that conflict mode to using it to our benefit to get into more productive collaboration? What would be the top two or three areas you think that out of everything?
So I think the place to start is the last thing that we just talked about, which is what is that shared goal that makes the collaboration worthwhile and makes it worth engaging with the other party or parties in the collaboration. Second one is perhaps one we've not specifically mentioned, but we've alluded to, is taking the time to listen to the perspectives of the other parties. So where are they coming from? What are the things that are important to them to get out of it? So if I'm the designer and I'm looking for a functional performance of something, I also want to listen to, you know, what do the manufacturing guys need in order to make that product easily enough, and not just so they have an easy life, which might be my default assumption. But if we listen, we learn actually we want it like that because we can make a better quality product that way. You know, we're not going to make mistakes. We're not going to compromise. We can achieve the cost targets, so we're helping the profitability of the company. You know, and so it's about, it's back to, you know, there's a quote, and depending on who you go to, it's attributable to either Stephen Covey in his book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or back to Francis of Assisi, which is seek first to understand, then be understood. So it's about listen first, appreciate the other person's point of view, then your point of view will get a listening from them as well. And then how do we put those two or three or four or however many sets of requirements together so we do the best job we can to meet everybody's requirements? So it's about generosity of listening. It's about not getting defensive. So some of it's about just people skills, if you like, good listening, willingness to understand and engage, and then work towards a position where everybody wins. You know,
so good scope definition.
That simple at its core. There's a lot of stuff you need to deliver that, but yeah.
Yeah, so good scope definition, good listening, good communication, and a common goal. It sounds like a good recipe for most projects or most things that we do in life, doesn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. I think that's a pretty good summary of you know, using your learnings over the years in some sort of pretty high pressure environments and challenging areas, but also how we can use that. And if you look at, you know, the businesses you've worked in there, you know, what's Mini turned into now, how's Rover gone from what they were to what they are now? Perhaps it's evidence that it works.
No, absolutely, because people see some of it as a failure because of the bits that didn't work. But if we look at the success of the Japanese car transplants, as you say, the Mini business in Oxford, Jaguar Land Rover's business across the UK and overseas, the foundations for all of that were laid in those difficult days by us learning to work together better.
Yeah. All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Harvey, for your time and an interesting conversation today.
No, my pleasure. I really enjoyed it, Matthew. Thanks for letting me come on.
All right, I'll speak to you again next time. Bye, everyone.
Okay, thanks. Bye, Matthew.